Okay, this is Uncle Matt's D&D Studio. I'm Matt Finch, and with me I have Jeff Talanian, who is the publisher of Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. I got that right, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the Swordsman and Sorcerer, I never know which one comes first.
It's a little bit of a tongue twister.
It is, yeah. So now Jeff has sent me a package of stuff, and so I have the package of stuff here, which I, honest to God, have not. I didn't like slit it open to see what was in there and then re-put tape on there or anything like that. See, there's authentic dog hair from the dog on there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the package and see what's in there while I've got Jeff here to then talk about anything that I pull out of here, because I've never really seen the point of pure unboxing videos where people only sort of show the thing that they've got, but obviously since they only just got it, they can't really, make any sort of comments on it. And so what I've got here is we're going to have the ability, assuming that I have the ability to actually open the box, to talk about the different things that are in here, even though I have not read any of them. So the first comment that I have here is excellent packaging, which is always one of those things with a game company that you want to look for. And okay,
shipping companies haven't been too friendly to me in the past, so I try to do my best to make sure that the books are bubble wrapped inside with packing paper in there, so that when the box does take a beating, which it will, that the contents inside will be hopefully in mint shape when they arrive to the fellow gamer.
We had a point in time where all of a sudden Frog God started having almost a 10% return rate for damaged books.
Yeah.
And we had to, rapidly turn around and change the way that we were doing the packaging. It's like it came out of nowhere. All of a sudden, the post office hired a bunch of people who really like destroying things.
Cost-wise, it's really not too much of a bump, and the whole process of it all. But it's a lot more time-consuming when you're bubble wrapping everything and putting packaging. It does take time for each package. It takes longer than just folding a box and taping it.
Also, bubble wrap takes an enormous amount of room in your garage.
Right. So
rolls of. Okay, so let me go ahead and show. And here we go. Now, this is a little bit difficult because what I see on my computer is a mirror image of what people are actually seeing. So we've got Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. And then we have a bottom line at the bottom of it that I can't read, which says a role-playing game of swords, sorcery, and weird fantasy. And so weird fantasy is your bag. Before we even open up the book and talk about the book, other than I will say that the production value on this book is very, very nice. This is not just a glue binding, so it's much higher quality than the stuff that's come out of Wizards of the Coast recently.
It's Smith-sewn.
And it is Smith-sewn. And what that means, folks, is that when, I don't think you're going to be able to see it on the camera, but when I open up this book to the spine, it means that I can see those threads down the middle of it. And what that is it means that that it is actually sewn to a cloth backing, and then the cloth backing is glued into the binding. And so that is, in terms of what's being done, that's the highest level of binding that you can get, although there are different levels of how this is done. You can get up to something that's library binding, which is way higher than the industry standard. I don't know. Do you know if this is library bound or is it just the Smythe sound?
I'm not entirely sure. I think that part of the difference between library bound and the standard Smith-sewn may be the signatures, which is the sheets of paper, how many that they're threading in at a time.
That's right. The library binding is done in 16-page or 8-page signatures or something like that. And it does look like these are in signatures, although
they are in signatures, but I don't remember the count on them. I'm pretty
Anyway,
sure the library.
bottom line is that we're talking about a very minor difference in terms of the quality. The fact of the matter is that the binding on this book, whether it's the Smythsonian or the library bound that we're talking about, you're talking about something that is very, very durable binding and highest level in terms of quality for the industry. But okay, so I did have that comment because I can look at the outside of the book. Let's talk about weird fantasy, though, because that is really your bag. What's weird fantasy in your eyes?
Well, weird fantasy to me is sort of embracing the darker side of the fantasy that we all know and love. Which, when I say that, I'm talking about Lord of the Rings and your high fantasy types of stories.
As being examples of not weird fantasy.
Correct. But for weird fantasy, when I think of that, I think of the pulp magazines of the 1920s and 30s, Weird Tales, and the different types of adventure magazines at that time period. Basically, Farnsworth Wright, who is the big publisher of Weird Tales, who was pushing this new style that you could say was pioneered by the likes of Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft, and that entire circle of people that were involved with the pulps at the time. So it is, it's a different style, it's a different take on what became sort of omnipresent, I would say, like in the the 1970s and 80s, with what we came to grow up with in fantasy. So this is sort of hearkening back to a different style.
Okay, now let's say one of the things, and again, viewers may not know it, but what you got here is an actual. This is it's a thick book, you can see. Mm-hmm. This is an actual complete role-playing game. This is not it's not a supplement for D&D. Or anything like that. It's a complete game. And so let's go to the question of, so you're targeting a genre, sort of the same way that like Jim Raji targets heavy metal. Sure. You've got a genre of fantasy here. What necessitated a separate game for it as opposed to something that was designed to tell you, here's how you play Dungeons and Dragons in this genre? Why the complete game?
Well, when I started it, I started to tinker with various classes in the game that we all love and see how can I adapt this to a more sword and sorcery type feel or weird fantasy feel. You take the bard, for instance, in Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers. What we did is the bard sort of taps into the mystical vibrations of the universe that sort of permeate the Black Gulf. And so he's drawing his powers from that type of source. We have necromancers in the game. We have all these different various classes. And so as I was developing these different classes, I started to realize that everything that I'm doing with them is a step to the left or a step to the right of what the known version of it is. So I realized that after a time that this can't just be a form of the OGL or the D20 SRD that's just copied and pasted and then house ruled. It has to be its own thing. And so by making its own complete game, part of the concept behind that also was marrying it to the setting of Hyperborea. So that's not just a rule system, that it's sort of a rule system that's built off of the setting, and the setting and the rules sort of play off each other.
Talk about the setting. What's the setting of Hyperborea? Now, I mean, Hyperborea, just again, for anybody who doesn't know, is it's a term, I think, from ancient Greek mythology.
Yes.
And it has to do with simply the Arctic, basically. But right. It became, over the course of the various writers of weird fantasy, a sort of mythic place, especially Clark Ashton Smith, who had Hyperborea stories. And so with that, tell me about your interpretation of the Hyperborea setting, what it means and why it's tied to the system.
Right. I think what it meant to me is taking something that I really enjoyed, which was basically the Clark Ashton Smith stories, and also Robert E. Howard's his sort of conception of Hyperborea as well, being a land during the Hyborian Age, where these where this mystical race of beings dwelled that were sort of it was the north of Samaria, and it was they were into the dark arts and sorcery and things like that. But also as I delved deeper into it and started to learn more about the Greek mythology behind it, I became interested in that as well. So Hyperborea is sort of for this game is sort of a melting pot of all those influences. But I've also thrown in other things that aren't necessarily drawn from the fiction tales that inspired it. Because I would say that there's a strong dose of, say, Abraham Merritt in here, Jack Vance, all the different swords and sorcery types of stories that I enjoyed, and different horror stories and things like that. So putting it all together in one type of setting that is presented in such a way that each of the descriptions of the lands, the religions, the cultures, they're done each in a brief but yet evocative way that is intended as a tool for the referee or game master to then expand upon for himself or herself.
And then one of the difficulties for anybody who's getting away from standard plain vanilla D&D, which I don't have a problem with, I actually like it, but if you're going to diverge from that, and you're going to diverge from some of the most popular visualizations of it, like the Lord of the Rings movie, for example, I would say that you would have a lot of difficulty just doing a system without doing that setting, because in addition to simply giving people the rules that are most easily used with a particular genre, you've also got to give people a reference point for that genre itself. Is that
right?
Part of what you were doing there?
Yes, so that I guess when you talk about that, you can talk about some of the first things that strike people when they look through the book. And this started back in 2012 when we published the original box set. And I would say that when you see that there are no hobbits in this game, there are no elves. It's various races and cultures of humanity.
No gnomes. There's no gnomes.
There's no gnomes. No, there's no.
Excellent.
There are no
Excellent.
demi-human races.
Very much.
Technically speaking, there are dwarves, but they're not the dwarves of Professor Tolkien. They are dwarves that live far under the ground, and they're vile, wretched creatures. Probably closer to the Norse mythology conception of them than what we come to know today in modern gaming. So when you strip away some of those high fantasy elements, the elves, the dwarves, the hobbits, your classics, say Red Dragon and things like that, and you replace it with these different cultures of humanity, and you don't have dragons, but you have Shoggoths and Migo and different elder beings from the black gulf of space, that alien worlds that have come to populate this sort of flat plain worlds that Hyperborea is in this setting. And if you want to take out the map, you would see that the map in the book, you would see that it is indeed a sort of flat Earth in which the seas spill eternally off the edge of the world.
In a second, I'm going to crack the book open like you were talking about. But since we are talking about the map, let me go ahead and show people what we're talking about here. It's probably a relief to have my face removed from the screen. I know that we are probably looking at my computer because I'm actively continuing to talk, which is important on Google. How are we doing here on the visibility?
Yes, it looks great. Looks great.
Okay. All right, good. So this is the map of Hyperborea that Jeff is talking about. This is a beautiful map.
Yes, it's 32 by 40 inches, and that was created by Mr. Glenn Seal of Monkey Blood Designs, who does fantastic work.
I was about to ask because it looks a little bit like Alyssa Faden's style, but you've got a little bit of the old third edition, not Waterdeep, Forgotten Realms kind of thing going on here. You got a little bit of Tolkien, the way that the trees are individually done. This is nice.
Yes, so he did that with pen and ink, and then with colored pencils. So there's really, except for a few minor embellishments with computer.
Hang on,
That's all hand done.
hang on. For the
Sure.
first time in almost history, I have refolded a folding map of this
Wow.
size without error. That's the first time ever, and
Yeah.
anybody who's really young doesn't understand. Road trips when you had maps just like that, and,
Right.
and think, okay, so that very important point made. Go back to what you were saying.
Sure. So he did it with colored pencils, and so there's very little computer embellishment there. So it's all hand drawn.
It definitely has that feel to it, and I think that is a real bonus both to art and to maps. I mean, one of the things at Frog God, is that I feel like, I wish we could do more stuff that was absolutely pure, hand drawn stuff. It is way more expensive to find a cartographer who is willing to put in that kind of time into putting something together. And so, one of the things that I've found about your products is that you spend lavishly on getting things exactly the way that you want to, at the sacrifice of your profits. And in fact, I'm not 100% sure, whether you're able, on a Kickstarter or something like that, to break even first time out of the box. So, definitely, kudos on that one. I think you spend, once again, it's you and Raji. I mean, I think maybe the genre emulation is people who simply can't live without having things exactly the way they want them. I don't know.
Yeah, or you could call it a control freak.
Person who can't live without having things the way that they want them is a kind way of saying control freaks. So,
yes.
I'm going to crack the book open.
Okay.
I'm ending up with spells here, and actually the particular page I'm looking at is, a lot of it has to do with it's OGL stuff, but I'm seeing here, for example, ultraviolet vision. The caster's eyes emit ultraviolet radiation in a 60-foot long cone, 30 feet wide at the terminus for the duration of the spell. The sorcerer can perceive the ultraviolet spectrum in various shades, etc., etc. The spell does not allow one to detect invisible objects or creatures, and that's a real interesting take. It's a second level spell, but it's basically a light spell that other people don't get the benefit of.
Right.
I like it.
Yes.
Switching along here, you have rules for mass warfare here.
Yes.
Okay.
That took quite a bit of work.
I bet it did.
Boiling it down to something that is really not intended for war gamers, but satisfying that urge when you're playing a fantasy game like this, and you want to have a large scale battle, whether it is 50 troops against another 75 troops, or if you're talking hundreds versus hundreds.
Mm-hmm. You have lots of illustrations in here. Well, at least I'm in the monster section, and there's lots of illustrations. That you sort of have to do that. But when I page through here, there's some nice spot illustrations. Let me put up your crystal ball here, and again, folks, this really is me just paging into the book. That is one cool ass crystal ball there with those fingers.
That's also Mr. Glenn Seal, who did the map that you were holding a few minutes ago.
Okay.
So he not only does cartography, but he also does illustration work as well.
And so overall here, you do have a sort of, there's a different feel. I've got a Holy Avenger, which is titled A Paladin in Hyperborea, and I will leave the truly old schoolers to know what reference that's to. I'm going to hold up the picture here. Now, we've got a pretty traditional looking knight here. That is authentic medieval sort of armor rather than having all the flanges. But what you notice down here is this guy as the bad guy, and over here we have what I think I can safely say is a Malebranche, a horned devil. But these okay, and we've got a barbed devil here, but the thing is that this overall picture has a very, very different feel than the equivalent that you saw in the first edition player's handbook of A Paladin in Hell.
Right.
It's got a darker sort of feel to it, a less precise sort of feel to it. How does that tell me how that plays into the genre approach that you're looking for?
Well, see, part of the genre approach, I don't want to neglect the gaming side of things, and I talk about the genre. So when I talk about the inspirations of say Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft, I put on an equal level with them Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, because what they did, in my estimation, is create their own mythology. Sure, they drew through all the things that they were inspired by, which share influences here. This is more of a tighter focus, though. Theirs was a broader influence spectrum that they drew from. But so the mythology they created and is just as strong, that I believe, as any of the fictional elements that we drew from for Hyperborea. So when you think about the old Dave Sutherland, A Paladin in Hell, that has a sort of nostalgic feel to it. So but we put it through a Hyperborea lens. So when Ian Bagley illustrated that particular one several years ago for the original box set of the game, that's what the goal was there, is to sort of give a tip of the hat to Mr. Sutherland.
And then you've got, when you talk about, that's a really interesting point about the mythologies created by Arneson and Gygax. They're quite different in a lot of ways. I mean, Arneson, I would say, was in many ways more weird fantasy than Gygax. And,
sure, the Temple of the Frog.
Right. And then on the other hand, with Gygax, what you've got is it's almost as if you took the 15th century or maybe as early as the 14th century, but you're talking about, the later period of the Middle Ages, really. And then you mapped into that a sort of Jack Vance approach to things. So it's still more swords and sorcery than I think most people perceive.
Fritz Leiber as well.
Yes, exactly. Fritz Leiber as well. With those two tend to go together in my mind, also Vance and Leiber. Jack Vance is Cudgel the Clever and the Dying Earth, and Lioness, and Fritz Leiber is Fafford and the Grey Mouser, and that series. So, and there's a very similar, very ironic feel to what goes on with theirs, as opposed to, with Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard. There is very little sort of lighthearted approach to things. I mean, they're really trying to do something else. So Arneson, I can really see fitting in well with the weird fantasy approach. Gygax, while it's a fascinating and a swords and sorcery setting, I wouldn't so much put Gygax in the weird fantasy area. Was that something that caused any kind of divergence when you were trying to put that all together?
I wouldn't say call it divergence. I tried to draw off all my inspirations, and I would say that that I definitely agree with you that Gary was very interested in Vance and Leiber, and you can almost see through his wit in various passages throughout the books that he draws a little bit from the humor side that Vance uses quite a lot, especially when you think about Cudgel.
He totally does. I mean, one of my favorite examples is that the original D&D books are riddled with typos. Some of those things are not typos, though. When he says dispel magic and spells it with 2 L's at the end, and it appears like you're misspelling the word dispel until you realize that that's dispel when it's done that way. And there are lots and lots of little tiny filigreed jokes in there.
In inside humor as well, I'm sure, with his friends in his gaming groups back in the time, and that meant for those guys to get a kick out of. But overall, to get back to your question, I think that I look at all of it, and I draw from the various things that inspire me there, and then fictional sources that inspire me, and then stuff that I just make up out of whole cloth.
I think that's great. Especially in terms of understanding how the setting is put together for use, in addition to having it as a support for the genre itself. Of here is an example of what this set of rules looks like when it's placed into a world. So, thanks awesomely for this book. I can't
Oh,
wait
my
to.
pleasure. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that I sent you this book because of my great appreciation for everything that you have done for this hobby. Basically sticking your neck out on the chopping block 12 years ago, or whatever it was, 12, 13 years ago, and risking it all so that guys like me could publish books and games like this. So
Well, and
it's
I
an
think
appreciation.
this is a great example of what it was that we were hoping was going to happen too. And so, and you're one of the most fun people to see at conventions too, because you've got that thing that I love about other publishers, that it's just your sense of fun particularly never seems to stop. I mean, you really come across as a kid who wandered into the middle of this convention.
Right.
And you're just having a blast,
Right.
and yet you're one of the major and more creative publishers that's walking around in there, having, I think, way more fun than a lot of the other
Yeah,
people
I
who
love
are
it.
there.
I mean, I just love, spending time with other gamers and watching other referees and game masters run their games. And I really love the convention scene. It's such a great fun. It's great to catch up with old friends, and it's also an opportunity to make new friends. It's kind of amazing that when you sit down at a table, I find a lot of times I run these different games. I could have as small a group as, say, 4 or 5 people, and I can have as large a group as, say, 10 or 12. And you start off a session that, and I'm sure you know this as well, Matt, you start off a session that's going to be, say, 4 hours or 5 hours long. And you could essentially have a group full of strangers all around you. By the end of that session, it's almost like you're all old friends because you've gone through this huge experience together, this collaborative, creative experience. And
Absolutely.
it's a great experience, and I would encourage anybody to join us at these various cons we go to, Gary Con or North Texas. I like the smaller cons that have more of the old school crowd, but definitely the larger cons are great too. I hear a lot of good. I haven't been to Gen Con in several years, but I hear it's still going strong, and Origins, and it's just great to get out there and game with people.
And that's one of the things I think, when I talk to starting publishers or people who are thinking about, becoming a publisher it's a lot easier these days than it used to be, because you've got print on demand, and you've got
Sure.
lots of other resources that have been developed for somebody to publish, even if they only have a very small amount of product. But after telling people the first piece of advice, which is, or sort of number one, you're not going to make a lot of money, and then number two, write for the system that you like, rather than trying to pick one that's going to be successful.
Right.
The third one that I tell people is, you've really got to love your fans, and you've got to love gamers. You've got to like the people that are out there that are going to be enjoying this stuff. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to be an extrovert, but you really have to love it, because there are going to be the pits and valleys. There are going to be the trolls. There are going to be the bad reviews. There's going to be this, that, and the other thing. But I think that that sort of just, I really love gamers, these are my people.
Yes.
Is a real important aspect to being a publisher, and that's one of the things that you're talking about there too.
Right. Yeah, I agree 100%. Spot on.
All right, and so with that, let's go ahead and say that Jeff, go ahead and say goodbye to our joint group of the fans that we love, that we were talking about.
All right, goodbye everybody, and thanks for joining us today.
And I'll do my sign-off line of whatever kind of D&D that it is that you play. Imagine the hell out of it.